5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Welcome back to Grey Swan TV. Today we'll be looking at part 2 of the government risk journey, and we'll be looking at two areas in particular, one being organisational culture and two being the complexity of systems in today's world and how increasing complexity leads to increasing risk. Hope you'll enjoy it. Let's start by looking at organisational culture. It probably is the biggest challenge to effective risk management. It's the iceberg that threatens not just every strategy, but every policy, regulation and service. We'll look at three parts of organisational culture. The first being a study of organisational cultures in the Australian public service. The second, a broader analysis of 4 organisational cultures over time. And the third is about how interpersonal fear in the workplace also impacts risk management behaviour. In the first study, Craig Matheson of Flinders University found that 4 organisational cultures that were identified in public policy, public administration theory were also found in the Australian public service. These 4 cultures are noted on the slide. Looking at the first subculture, hierarchy, it was strongest in middle and senior management, and it included aspects like people knowing their place, and people being excluded, disregarded, and being made to feel of no value. The second one, individualism, was primarily about promotion and power and looked at an ongoing competition for promotion. The third group involved informal peer groups emerging within workplaces, leading to insular, suspicious, and adversarial behaviours between groups. It also involved policies that limited entry to the public service to certain categories and classes of people. And lastly, the fourth group, fatalism, involved references to staff being treated as the living dead, where surveys consistently identified fatalist traits such as a lack of commitment, disengagement, and a lack of care about their agency. The next case study in relation to organisational culture is based on a book by Dov Seidman. He looks at 4 types of increasing organisational complexity and social maturity over time. As you can see, the first one's anarchy, loose and lawless groups, where a focus is on immediate survival. The second one, blind obedience, think industrial revolution, plentiful, unskilled and cheap labour, management being all-powerful. The third model is what's called informed acquiescence. This is largely based on 20th century capitalist culture with a rules-based top-down hierarchy, with bureaucracy based on functions, information being controlled, carrot and stick motivators, and an emphasis and deference to rules and compliance, with strong controls for fairness and impartiality. Now, when you compare this with obviously the cultures we've looked at before in the public service and my own experience of the last 20 years in the Australian public service, I think that the cultures identified both by Dov Seidman and Matheson are still prevalent. The fourth type of culture identified by Dov Seidman is in relation to self-governance. This is a values-based rather than rules-obsessed model involving the types of characteristics you see on the slide. Seidman's thesis is that in a world of increasingly connected knowledge workers, organisations and leaders need to change from command and control to connect and collaborate, from coercion and motivation to you, to inspiration which happens in you, from exerting power over people to generating power through them. Seidman identifies companies with this type of culture as including Google, Amazon, Intel, and the US hospital group. The third study of organisational culture is through the lens of psychological safety. This in particular is from Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organisation, and it looks at the factors that help and hinder workforce collaboration and the taking of interpersonal risk. Psychological safety is when people are not hindered by interpersonal fear and feel willing and able to take the inherent interpersonal risks of candour. Edmondson also looked at multiple studies across many industries and in particular looking at the themes or reasons why there was an epidemic of silence and employees did not speak up at work on issues that concerned or affected them.
These included they did not want to be seen in a bad light, not wanting to embarrass or upset someone, futility, fear of retaliation or career consequences, don't speak up unless you have solid data. According to Edmondson, these things led to the voice-silence asymmetry in the table. Now let's move away from organisational culture to the next phase of today, which is looking at increasingly complex systems and wicked environments. In the book Meltdown, Why Our Systems Fail, What We Can Do About It, Chris Clearfield and Andres Tilsik consider the paradox of progress, how more capable systems are becoming more complex, and the two major factors that are driving this complexity, how different parts of the system interact with one another, and the extent to which there is tight coupling or slack in the system. Complexity doesn't mean sophistication, it just means an inability to easily identify the problem. So that's the first part. And the second, the extent of tight coupling. It's not always good in a tightly coupled system to get most things right. Inputs must be precise and combined, but redoing it is not always an option if you get it wrong the first time, and sometimes there are no substitutes or alternatives. And the increasing complexity leads to organisational challenges such as those listed. Many areas of government activity are complex, closely intertwined and subject to a variety of factors which can significantly affect the system they're part of, nor is it easy to identify the source of problems arising in these systems. In many areas, increased complexity creates opportunities for wrongdoing, and tight coupling only amplifies the consequences. So let's look at 4 well-known case studies that highlight how these challenges can lead to catastrophic outcomes. The first of these is the Challenger space shuttle, which exploded soon after launch in January 1986. The O-rings intended to seal joints in the solid rocket booster failed due to the cold launch temperatures. NASA had known about this problem initially 9 years earlier, when engineers who'd created the rocket boosters had identified it. 12 months before the accident, a NASA employee wrote a memo that said, "There is little question that flight safety has been and is still being compromised by potential failure of the seals, and it is acknowledged that failure during launch would become catastrophic." 9 months before the accident, O-ring erosion affected another Challenger launch, and both the primary and secondary O-rings were severely damaged. Morton Thiokol wrote another memo which said the result, if the same scenario should occur, would be a catastrophe of the highest order. And then the night before the launch, another engineer spoke up at the pre-launch meeting, raising concerns that the unusually cold temperatures might cause the O-rings to fail. As his data was incomplete and the arguments vague, he was not listened to. A disturbingly similar tale of ignorance also applies in relation to case study 2, Fukushima. On 11 March 2011, 14-metre high tsunami waves breached the power plant's 10-metre high seawalls and flooded the site. It led to a nuclear meltdown. And yet, in the year 2000, the company owning Fukushima acknowledged that tsunamis could reach 15 metres in height and recommended internally that they should increase the walls for the flooding risk. In 2006, a professor who was an expert on Japanese island seismic activity and tectonics also wanted to review the height of the wall. In 2007, he published an article that basically believed that Japan was overdue for an earthquake. But he was criticised as being a nobody. And finally, in 2009, there was also another meeting and another expert who said that there would be an earthquake that would have waves in excess of the size of the wall. The third case study is the Deepwater Horizon, which at that time was the deepest well ever. Put simply, they did not manage complexity and focused on a whole lot of safety issues that had nothing to do with the actual major risk of the wellhead blowing. The last case study relates to the home insulation program, which was a program implemented during the GFC to create stimulus, but unfortunately, as the results show on the slide, was badly implemented and led to a number of deaths due to electrocution. The key risk being ignored was that there was a similar rollout of an insulation program in New Zealand, which was floor insulation, which led to electrocution deaths, but this risk was ignored in Australia on the basis that it was roof installation.
Well, that concludes today's presentation.
This has been a GS TV production.